would say it's the biggest piece of energy legislation that the state has ever passed. Huge piece of energy legislation. Passed in about 1 month, the first month of the legislative session. But it's not that they first came up with the idea when they went to St. Paul this year. This actually had been passed in essentially the same form in a prior legislative session. So they came into the session knowing what they wanted to pass. The House had passed it in the same form. It didn't pass in the Senate in prior sessions. But the Senate, either the people in the Senate had already advocated for it in prior sessions, or the new senators that were coming into the Senate to provide a majority for the DFL had ran on the platform. So this was the second key vote. Abortion was first. This was the second key vote in the session where they held their caucus together for the DFL and passed this piece of legislation. So it passed within a month of the legislature coming into session, roughly a month. The governor signed it on February 7th. And they have made good on this effort in the legislature to pass these key priorities by a caucus vote. And that was kind of what they set out to do, and we've seen that happen pretty much as they set out to do it. And 2040 was one of the first key examples of that, where you had party line vote and it passed in both houses and signed by the governor by the 7th of February 2023. And what it does essentially, in one sentence, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what this means, but it requires that by 2040, all electricity that you purchase in the state of Minnesota, it's not focused on the generation source, it's focused on purchases, will be carbon-free. It also sets interim targets. It's not just that you get there by 2040, which is soon in the electric utility business, but it also says by 2030 you have to be at this point, by 2035 you have to be at this point, and by 2040 you have to be carbon-free. And in addition to carbon-free, it also reinforces and increases our renewable energy standard. We've had a RES, or a renewable energy standard, in the state since 2007. To say that we had to be at least 25% wind and solar, essentially, from a concept standpoint. Those renewable energy standard numbers were also increased into the future as part of this bill. Now, it's important to note that we were already rapidly decarbonizing as a state prior to this bill passing. This is a path that is not new for Minnesota. It's not new for the nation, certainly not new for Minnesota. Within about a year prior to this passing, within the last 18 months, say, what utilities have filed at the Public Utilities Commission showing what their generation portfolios were going to look like in the future showed that even prior to the passage of this bill, by 2032, all utilities in Minnesota as a whole would be 70% carbon-free by 2032. So it was a path that we were already going down rapidly as a state. This certainly accelerates it and puts some mandates in place to make sure that that continues to happen. Great River Energy is an example of, co-ops are already leading in this transition. Great River Energy, for example, which is where Lake Region Electric Cooperative gets their wholesale power from, and they're going to speak to us about their future plans now in light of the 2040 bill in a little bit. But even before this, they were committed to an 80% reduction by 2032 of carbon. So co-ops were already leading in this path to transition to renewable energy. But by passing this bill, Minnesota is not unique, okay? This is not something that no one else in the nation is doing. In fact, 21 states and territories have already acted on kind of similar concepts. So I want to be clear that this is not just something that Minnesota has baked up and no one else is doing. But the other thing that's worthy to note is by passing this bill a few months ago, we have now jumped pretty far into the lead, if you will, on the aggressiveness of what this standard establishes. So the District of Columbia and Rhode Island, both really big, a lot of our resources come from those two areas. They're still ahead of us in terms of the timing required, but we're now tied with New York for either first, depending on how you think about District of Columbia and Rhode Island, or third, and again, kind of tied with New York in terms of the aggressiveness of the standard that's been established by this bill. And of those 21, roughly half of those, as the slide shows, are goals. So they've set things that are actually not required by law. And to be clear, the 2040 mandate in Minnesota now is not a goal. We sort of had similar goals, essentially, in the state already prior to this bill, but this bill now makes it a mandate that we have to get to these levels by 2040.